Hello, I'm Paul Whitkay, founder and CEO of the Alliance of Chief Executives. Welcome to our latest Visionary Leaders Roundtable. As all of you know, our world is being transformed in many profound ways, and our series of Visionary Leaders Roundtables have been designed to give all leaders the opportunity to gain insights into how leaders in very different industries are driving changes which will impact how all of us live, work, and play. So far, we've explored the future of health and healthcare, food and agriculture, energy and environment in past roundtables. And today, we're very privileged to have a panel of amazing leaders from across very many different sectors of the transportation mobility ecosystem. So let's meet our panelists. And let's start off with Mark Joseph.
Thank you, Paul, and glad to be with you. I am the former CEO of Transdev and Veolia, North America and Latin America, UK and Ireland, running large bus and rail systems. And I am CEO of Mobitas Advisors, investing, advising, and providing board governance to a number of early and mid-stage businesses, as well as some large mature transportation companies.
Thank you. Jane.
Good day, everyone. My name is Jane McFarland. I'm the director of Smart Cities and the Institute of Transportation Studies at UC Berkeley. I have a background mostly in industry with Navtech, OnStar, General Motors, and the like. And my focus is mostly in artificial intelligence and geospatial analytics.
Thank you. Pat/Peter from Australia.
Thanks, Paul. G'day, I'm Peter Burley. I'm Sydney-based. I'm the founder and MD of a business called the Aluminium Revolution Chassis Company. We're building hydrogen electric vehicles and applying our technology to lightweight modular structures. And we're very grateful for the opportunity to be at this roundtable today and hear from everyone and what's going on, particularly as we move towards a zero-emission future.
Thank you. Takidra.
Hi there. Thanks, Paul. It's really a pleasure to be here. I'm Takidra Malakana, co-CEO of Waymo. We are focused on building an autonomous vehicle technology company, specifically the Waymo Driver. We want the driver to be generalizable and deployed across a host of business lines. So far, we've launched a fully commercial service in Arizona, as well as testing routes to the airport in Arizona, and we have a service in San Francisco. We also have a long-haul trucking business unit, as well as local delivery. It is the technology challenge of our generation, and I feel like we are well situated for the future, and I'm really happy to have this conversation.
Thank you. Stefan.
Good to meet all of you. Stefan Heck, founder and CEO of Notto. We use AI and computer vision to help large commercial fleets and auto OEMs help drivers drive better and eliminate 50 to 80% of all collisions on the road.
Thank you. Arvid.
Hello, nice to meet you. Thank you for having me. I was CEO of Mercedes-Benz R&D North America, having developed electric vehicles for many, many years. I'm now at Saku. We are 3D printing solid-state batteries, and I'm in charge of the battery business unit there.
Thank you. Gary.
Hi, Gary Geisen. I'm CEO of Wisk Aero. We're building an aircraft. Our 5th generation is behind me. It's all electric, it's self-flying, so no pilot in the cockpit. This is a joint venture between a company funded by Larry Page called Kitty Hawk, and then Boeing Company, the Boeing Company, who is our majority investor. So those are our 2 shareholders. But the problem we're out to solve is congested cities, pick any of your large New York, LA, Mumbai, London, etc., doing short hop 10 to 20 minute flights and really saving being stuck in your car for an hour and a half to 2 hours.
We hope you do it. Rashik.
Good afternoon, good morning to everyone. It's an honor to be here, and thank you, Paul. Rashik Zarif here. Formerly was the head of innovation at Mercedes-Benz, and then the head of future mobility at Deloitte. But since shifted and started a new venture, I'm the co-founder and COO of Rewire, vision focusing on transforming the built environment for a smarter and more sustainable future. In a nutshell, we really are working and supporting real estate developers in getting property technology on their properties, really to support the growth of mobility at an accelerated rate.
Thank you. Dragos.
Hi, I'm Dragos Machuca. I'm currently with Meta working on virtual reality, trying to teach a software company how to do hardware. But for the previous 7 years, I started and led Ford's technology office in Palo Alto, looking at autonomy, software architecture, basically doing the opposite, trying to teach a hardware company how to do software.
Great, thank you. So now that we know who all the panelists are, I'm going to ask each of them to briefly describe how they see the future of transportation and mobility and how it'll be different from today. I'd like to start with Alliance member Stefan Heck, CEO of Nauto, because in 2019, he actually was the catalyst for doing this, because he saw he was part of the ecosystem that was changing transportation. And he suggested we bring leaders from all throughout the industry together so we did. We gathered 20 amazing leaders. 4 of them are here today on our panel in his boardroom back in 2019. Frankly, in 2020, when COVID hit, we all learned how to participate via Zoom and virtually. So it actually enabled us to bring it open up to leaders everywhere, because when we start talking about the future, it doesn't have to be confidential. We're not talking about the confidential individual strategies of each company here. We're talking about leaders in the ecosystem, the industry, and what they're trying to create. And there's no one company that I know of that is dominating or dictating where the future is going to be. So we're learning from each one of them. And so I'd like to start off with Stefan and just a really brief perspective on your vision as to what the future of transportation mobility is going to look like.
Yeah, thanks very much, Paul, and thanks for convening everybody. 10 years ago, in 2012, I proposed a vision that the world in transportation was moving to ACES, autonomous, connected, electrified, shared, and that we were going to see in our lifetime a productivity shift of 15x increase in productivity, similar to what the Industrial Revolution did for energy. What's interesting now, 10 years in and looking out the next 5-6 years, though that is still happening, but at different rates. We're seeing connected is extremely far along. Almost every new vehicle is connected. Even scooters and handhelds have made everything available online. We're seeing electrification right at the tipping point. And if you look 5 years out, I think more than half of new vehicle sales will be electric of various kinds. And of course, everything from small form factors all the way to buses. We're seeing sharing has had mixed impact from the pandemic. Goods sharing and building sharing and having things delivered has increased, but people have been a little bit more reluctant to share that Uber or Lyft for the pandemic duration. It's coming back now, but still, if you look globally, still a pretty niche. If you look at even all buses and all ride sharing together, still pretty niche in terms of total transportation. And then autonomous, I think some of the other speakers here will talk about it in more detail, but is taking off in pockets, but is definitely not everywhere the way that people predicted, in 2017, 2019, that we were all going to be sitting in autonomous vehicles. And so it's lagging behind. I look forward to this discussion.
Okay, thank you. Let's go to Rashik.
I think, when it comes to the future, we're going to get a lot of perspectives here, and then let's just assume status quo, that the future of mobility happens the way we all generally would like to see it. One of the major roadblocks, in achieving that is infrastructure, and getting that infrastructure to support mobility, not only from a public perspective, but also private. So I would say that, what I see happening in about five years or so is the fact that other industries coming into play to support the realization of future mobility, because as we can have seen, both with respect to what has happened with the pandemic, it's no longer about people getting to places, but how we get stuff to people as well. That has led to a lot of challenging situations, including the supply chain situation that we've all been dealing with for quite a while now. So that equilibrium will come to realization, but it requires a lot of effort from the real estate industry to support that. We're not talking about individual homes, but commercial real estate, industrial, to support not only with individual locations, but a network of locations. So really bullish in the sense of seeing things happening, but it does require, a helping hand from the private sector, and not only relying on the public sector to that realization.
Thank you. Takitra, what's your perspective?
Yeah, my perspective sort of builds on the prior two. I think I agree with what Stefan said. Certainly, autonomous vehicles have taken longer to date to fully materialize. I think within the 5-year horizon, it's actually going to be a pretty exciting time frame, because I think there will be more autonomous. There will be more people who have experienced a fully autonomous, without a human driver behind the wheel, ride then than certainly now. I think what we've learned is as people experience it, it actually changes the attitude about it, as well as expands the option set for it. Not only the value it brings to people's lives, but also to cities, policymakers, the way they start thinking about it changes quite drastically. So I think we will be at just the beginning of collectively understanding the potential benefit of this shift. Oftentimes people say, like, you're not going to take my car out of my hands. I like driving. And in my mind, that's not necessary. There will be people who own cars. There will be people who ride in shared fleets. A lot of those shared fleets won't have a driver behind the wheel, and they will make the roads safer. I also think from a trucking perspective, 5 years from now, with autonomous technology, we'll start to have less consternation around labor shortages. We'll start to figure out how you actually improve some of those workforce issues with more of a local emphasis versus a long haul emphasis. And my hope is that people who right now get behind the wheel a little buzzed just simply find that they have a physical safety as well as mobility safety option to move into a vehicle. That's their third space, where they can be not behind the wheel, but rather in the passenger seat and get safely from point A to point B.
All right. Thank you. Arvid, what's your perspective?
Yeah, so I see a lot of disruption happening in an extent that has never been seen before for the automotive industry. So not only the supply chain challenges that we have seen already over the last years with chips and everything else, but also at the same time, the transition to electrification. And at the same time, also strong swings in the marketplaces due to, of course, the pandemic and other things. So I think it's like a perfect storm coming together from all these sides. Now, the key challenges that have not been changed, not been really solved yet, are that for electrification, batteries are still too expensive in the large scale, and smaller car players, like small to medium car players, will keep struggling definitely to remain or even become profitable in the first place. So the electrification is really accelerated by climate change visibility, and companies need to build a completely new supply chain responsibility. And as we see, car companies are starting to look into mining themselves, not so controlling the whole supply chain from the very raw material. And this is combined with even more difficult geopolitical challenges and the intent by countries to become independent of other countries. So it really is these key things coming together: supply chain challenges combined with the geopolitical challenges and climate change, and managing all of these together. So I think this is a very, very intense challenge, more than I've ever seen in my life. And I think that not every car company is really ready and up for this. And then additionally, we see legislation that is even now requiring to combine the pure technical performance and safety of the vehicle with even supply chain challenges. So there has to be a certain local content for electrified vehicle in battery materials and battery vertical integration. So I think we'll see the strong will survive, but it's going to be very exciting to see who that is. And I think also customers will notice that some type of cars and models will just not be offered anymore because companies cannot keep them in a profitable way.
Right. Thank you. Dragos?
Yeah, so for 7 years I've been looking at robotaxis and at autonomy from that point of view. Now that I can actually step back, I have this vision of autonomy that gets split into very different places, so that we're not forced to only talk about, well, it's going to be in the next 20 years or it's going to be in the next 5 years. And I got my thesis in autonomous vehicles in 97, and it was supposed to be 20 years out. In the 50s, when the first concept came out, it was 20 years out. So now we are 5 years out on a rolling basis. So I think the way I split in my head, at least, it's in this 2x2 matrix of chaos versus speed, where robo taxis are in that tough corner of high speed, high chaos, and it's challenging enough from a technical point of view because you're not relying on the infrastructure almost at all. But then from a business model point of view, taxi drivers are relatively inexpensive, pushed down by Uber and Lyft, and all of a sudden you cannot make a business case for recovering your investment costs. However, the other corners I think are much more interesting. So you have the high chaos, high speed, where you basically, high chaos, low speed, where you have delivery bots around the city. And we all, again, through the pandemic, are used to having deliveries done in our homes all the time. The safety part can be ameliorated a lot easier. You can run it a lot slower. And the consequences to comfort and what happens inside the vehicle are very low. The opposite corner, the diagonal corner of high speed, low chaos, it's trucking. It's as Takeda said, there's a clear business case for long distance trucking. Truck drivers are expensive; they're hard to find, so that makes a lot of sense to look at that space. And then you have the lower one, which is low chaos, low speed, which is basically everything else. So everything that's off-road, mining, construction, agriculture, indoors, where it's a lot easier to have autonomy. The payback is a lot shorter, and the consequences of a failure are a lot lower. So I think even though it's not sexy, I think it's an area that's very interesting from a business point of view, and from autonomy actually becoming something that we're going to see in the next few years.
All right, thank you. Jane, what's your perspective?
Yeah, well, I come from a control systems background, so I think that, we are going to need to learn how to use our transportation infrastructure much more effectively. And when we talk about connected vehicles and autonomous vehicles and the like, what we really need to think about, we need to go beyond that, is if we've got all this information about where these vehicles are, what's the best way to move them around? And to do this, we're going to end up with a data-driven, coordinated mobility system that integrates kind of the multitude of all the transportation modes that we're talking about. So transit, train, vehicles, bikes, pedestrians, air taxis, and the like. And we have to put those all together in an equitable and safe environment, which means today's infrastructure is going to have to change. And it's going to reconfigure to protected bike lanes, bus stations, walkways. So the whole physical infrastructure is going to morph as we go forward. And if you think about the way regional control is managed right now, like for example, the size of the Bay Area, we've got like 100 different cities all trying to achieve their own goals. We've got the state DOTs trying to change things for their own goals. Then you add in the navigation applications that are running in fleets and personal vehicles and transit operations. And you've got a complex set of conductors all trying to orchestrate the mobility in the region. So we are going to have to get much smarter about how we move everybody around. We're going to have to use high performance computing to predict dynamics and artificial intelligence and the like, and start thinking about active control ideas for connected vehicles to optimize traffic in terms of safety and travel times and energy and health impacts. So, consider, for example, suppose the entire fleet was automated. What would you tell them to do? If they all took the shortest path to get to their destination, we would have complete chaos in the Bay Area. So I think that's where we're heading. I'm on the board of a little company that does cloud control of traffic lights. And so we're going to end up with a multi-tiered control system that's trying to manage regional mobility on the order of like a digital twin, if you will, to try to predict what the behaviors are going to be, intelligently control traffic, and all the while achieving our mobility and economic objectives in a safe and effective way.
All right, thank you. Mark.
So, Paul, I come from a fleet world, and so I have an admitted bias towards fleet, but I believe we will see much more of a shift from personal ownership to fleet ownership. We may see variations on this in terms of what personal ownership, what forms it comes in, like subscription. But I think what's interesting is that there's so much money that has been flowing in from new entrants into the mobility world, whether they're OEMs or whether they're technology companies. These are some great companies. What I think is underestimated is the importance of operations, fleet operations, and fleet experience. That's maintenance, that's dispatch, routing, scheduling, safety, all of these aspects of having these services interact with human riders. And so I think there will be a key role here. Secondly, I think that from a transit perspective, I think transit will have a role to play, bus and rail. I think it needs to evolve in terms of the user experience significantly. And I think there's tremendous inefficiency currently in many transit operations. And so I think they will be reconfigured. I think COVID has helped to provide an opportunity for a reset and to change the way transit organizations think about it, and also about the use of lanes and whether those lanes can be offered to micromobility and other services that could coexist well. Third is the evolution of mobility as a service. When we see this more scaled autonomous vehicles, and we see operating costs drop from $2 a mile, let's say, to 20 cents a mile, then we might see the ultimate killer app in mobility as a service. And that is a true subscription arrangement where riders get all they can eat. This is tantamount or similar to Amazon Prime or Netflix for transportation. And so that you can ride any of these services for a monthly fee. And then the last couple comments are impact on real estate. I think we'll see a dramatic change in terms of how parking lots, gas stations, shopping centers are used, and how they might be reconfigured based on this kind of new world. And finally, the role of the driver. Takidra talked about the role of the driver changing. Certainly, we need to protect workers, but not those jobs. Those jobs need to change. And we can see now drivers may be moving from the front of the vehicle to the back of the vehicle. Think about an autonomous school bus with somebody in the back of the vehicle with the kids and helping them to learn while they're riding. Or people with disabilities having someone as an attendant in the back of the vehicle instead of the front of the vehicle. So we'll see a shift in that regard as well.
All right, thank you. Peter.
When I was asked to think about what we saw the next 5 years as being, reminded me of a quote that said, "Today's lamented modern ways will be tomorrow's good old days." And I think that pretty much sums up where we are at the moment as we move from internal combustion engines to gazetted and legislated aspirational targets around zero emission fleets. But to predict a path forward and what that experience will be like, I think will be determined by the roadblocks along that path. And I think if we think we're going to see, as Stefan said, massive change very quickly to entire fleets, that is a very attractive fiction. The fact is that announcements and policies, particularly here in Australia, have been made prematurely and shouted out without any real regard for the reality of infrastructure and the time it's going to take to develop it, the cost, particularly the grid capacity, contract models as to how that's going to be operated in terms of cost and what those cost outcomes would be, standards and development is another really big factor. We are building hydrogen vehicles here without actually legislated standards at the moment. Those standards are being developed. And the other one that we're facing is labour constraints, and as a couple of other people said, supply chain integrity. So if you ask me to look about the next 5 years in regard to those points, I think it's a bit like watching the sorting hat on Harry Potter. There'll be the factors that we need to move in a meaningful way will be determined by the first movers in this space. So what it feels like for me as a manufacturer of hydrogen vehicles, it's almost like we're the first wagons moving out on the plains of the gold rush. If you Google in Australia, we are moving very quickly towards trying to put in place changes from where we've been good in Australia, digging holes and mining, to a very much hydrogen-driven future where we see hydrogen as our new gold. So for us, being in mobility, we're seen as being the first mover in that space, and particularly around government buses, because they're a return to base arrangement. They use significant amounts of hydrogen, so 30 kilos a day, 100 buses, 3 tonnes a day across maybe 30 or 40 fleets. That is a very big change to the way that we currently operate our route bus system at the moment. So when we thought initially about what the deployment of zero-emission vehicles would be, we thought electric. But to put that into perspective and why our grid wasn't really designed to run our public transport system, charging one bus overnight uses the equivalent amount of power of around energy in 50 homes. So if you're charging 100 buses down the road and someone's watching Netflix, it's likely their telly might click off. So we saw that when CNG buses were first introduced. We would have large CNG fleets, people would turn on their ovens and no gas had come out. So the metrics around the commerciality of the transition to zero-emission vehicles, particularly here in Australia, hasn't been worked out. And of course, as I think Mark was talking about, we need to get to a point of parity, but the mechanics of supply and demand, they will sort that out going forward. But as first movers, I think, as we mentioned, the data sets that we give will be the way that we determine how we actually roll out something meaningful and substantially. So we see technology evolving. We see it very much as being horses for courses, whether it's an electric vehicle or whether it's a hydrogen vehicle. But as I said, at the moment, we see geopolitically change, particularly in our part of the world, as being a very determining factor, because I'm not sure what's happening particularly in the Northern American continent, but geopolitically here, there is a major drive for localization, and I think that localization drive will also be a significant player in what happens in mobility going forward.
Thank you. Gary, you get to back cleanup.
All right, sounds good. Well, let's talk about the air. So I'm involved with a company that's in a market space. It has that horrible acronym, which I won't go over, but it's the air taxi market. Some people call it a flying car. It's not a car. It's actually aircraft. There have been billions of dollars that have been invested in this market segment. And the problem that is trying to be solved is if you're stuck in your car in any congested city for an hour and a half, 2 hours, obviously incredibly unproductive. It's unpredictable. You're not quite sure when you're going to get to your destination. If you could take a flight that's a 10 to 20 minute flight, and if it was affordable as an everyday mode of transportation, you're fundamentally going to change the world. So the longer term view of this is not the 3 to 5 year vision. This is more like a 10-year vision. It takes a lot to certify new aircraft and get something into service. But we're a part of an ecosystem that will be a system. And so we'll be the flight part of it that'll solve a big problem. But you need to get to your flight and you need to get from your flight to where you need to go. And so there's all the previous speakers and the whole ride sharing component, autonomous cars, et cetera, play into that kind of mode. Rail and bus can play into that kind of mode. If you play that out and you assume a world where people have affordable everyday transportation that involves some kind of transport to your flight, an air taxi that takes you 10 to 20 minutes, and some back-end transport that gets you to where you want to go, then the world has kind of changed, because if you think of cars and how much they are utilized, they're incredibly underutilized. Your car is parked in your garage overnight and does nothing. You drive to work and it sits in the parking lot and does nothing. It's not a productive asset, if you will. So if you can change that dynamic, and I think one of the previous speakers mentioned parking structures change, perhaps they completely go away. You think about the trillions of dollars of infrastructure that's being spent to try to improve our roadways that are crumbling. We'll never be able to keep up with the demand if everybody has a personal car. And so, our vision of this, you can blue sky a little bit, but if you take to the air, which is uncrowded, it's actually an easier technical problem to solve than doing an autonomous car. If you do an autonomous aircraft, it's a harder regulatory problem, but it's a much easier technical problem. If you're able to solve that system and put that system together, you'll fundamentally change people's lives, improve people's lives, get people to where they actually want to be instead of stuck in some kind of transport mode. So the future is very exciting. Our horizon's, a bit longer. I'll put it as a decade out before all these pieces come together, but it's incredibly exciting and very transformational.
All right. Well, let's have a conversation.
I'll jump in with the first question. I was intrigued, Dragos, by your comment that now you can speak freely. I'll ask you the question you couldn't answer before, which is, if you're an OEM, given the 2x2 matrix you painted, where should the OEM play? Where should they invest? Because historically, they've mostly invested in robotaxis, which is in your hard corner.
Yeah. That's a good one, because I didn't leave a box for what the OEM should be, because the issue with OEMs like Ford is that you don't have trucking. So someone like Volkswagen, Mercedes, they have trucking, so they can put it in there. Nor do they have only delivery bots. So, for someone like Ford, you would go a little bit on the delivery side. So Ford e-Transits, where you have the same issue that you have with private cars, is that someone shows up at the work site, and then maybe they don't need that van anymore. Maybe that van can go somewhere else and help another worker. Or maybe you need a tool at the last minute, and you can have a delivery bot come in, which can be an transit, e-transit, and bring you that. So that's one of the areas where they can play in. The other one, I really do think that ADAS, high-level ADAS, I see basically a world where you still drive your cars for the next 5 to 10 years, but accidents become a thing of the past. So it becomes something more like an autopilot in airplanes, like not the Tesla kind that still kills people, but and by the way, that's a different story. I don't necessarily want to make fun of them, because I do think that Tesla actually has saved a lot of lives. The problem is this bias towards the fact that we don't know this imbalance. We don't know the life saved, and they can be 10, 100, 1,000, but we know exactly who Tesla's autopilot killed. And that delta, it's a problem, because the same with autopilots in planes. When a plane lands, the pilot, the human, is not going to tell you, it's like, oh, without autopilot, I would have killed you today, right? But we know for sure that autopilot has saved thousands, if not tens of thousands of lives over the years. But when Boeing kills 300 people, you know about that. So I think that imbalance is going to cause problems for a pretty long time, and only statistics are going to show that we are reducing lives. So to really answer your question, I would put the OEM somewhere in the middle of those 4 boxes.
Well, you also tee up an interesting question. I'd love to hear other viewpoints on this. When will we reach, peak crashes, peak fatalities? We thought we were there a decade ago, right? When things kept improving. Aerospace certainly has gotten there. We're lowest ever historically, but it has been rising for the last couple of years.
I'll jump in just from a different perspective. 1.35 million people died in 2021 in automobile accidents. I mean, it's just an incredibly large number, to the point, Stefan and Dragos, that you made. 2 Maxes drop out of the sky, 300 and something people die, and it's front page news for a long time. And so the role of everybody here in the panelists and this whole electrification and making things autonomous is reducing workload and improving safety. And I have been an owner of Tesla, and now I'm owner of Ford, and I'm using their Blue Cruise and their level 2 self-driving features, but it reduces workload so that I can focus on the more strategic things, which I think is super important. I think a big misconception is that people are going to be slow to adopt this, because I think once they understand the safety case behind these things, and automobile crashes go down, aviation crashes go down, even though aviation is just incredibly safe, it will get even safer. That you'll see a social change for people willing. It won't be the bungee jumping crowd that are the first to adopt some of these things. It will actually be more mass market. But it's once we start showing the safety case of this, and I'm all for the autonomous technologies, even the hard things, the level 2 self-driving is not that great, but it's better than having to drive and pay attention to all the variables as a driver. And so I think as we reduce workload for pilots, if you will, in both automobiles and aircraft, this will be a better world and a safer world.
Yeah, I would just add, I like your question, Stefan. I would just say that 2 things. One, that what you're doing, what Mobileye has been doing, and others, we can start to see when things will, and then with ultimate autonomy, we will see this dramatically change. I think the most surprising thing to me was to hear a very, very successful insurance exec who founded a multi-billion-dollar business say that the future of insurance is almost dead. So that's thinking about the impact of what the safety will be. When will it happen? Not sure. But if you were going to bet on buying insurance companies, you might think differently based on some definite change here.
My own observation, and several of you talked about the government's role in the larger infrastructure in the federal, state, and local and international challenges we all face to integrate it. Who has a perspective on how some of those issues are going to be resolved? Is it from a bottoms up, local cities by local, or some federal? How? And Gary, I know you're experimenting in New Zealand and flying flights there, and Peter, you're in Australia. How do we actually make this work? It's such a complex equation. Jane's been working on this for years. So how do you guys see it coming together?
I mean, I'll give my answer, Paul, which I think is also an answer to Carl's excellent question online. What's the least widely accepted or unpopular belief that's likely to become a reality? I don't think we can do this without some level of government regulation and alignment. And Gary obviously lives in a world where that's already the case. Everything in the air is federally regulated. I think the mess we have right now, where every state competed for AVs by being the loosest in regulations, was not a good dynamic. And I think fundamental problems like who is still responsible for the remaining collisions does need to get settled, because while we all believe these technologies, I agree with what Mark said earlier, can save a huge number of lives, right? But if we can reduce 80% of the fatalities, but increase 1% in some other area that a human would not have made that mistake, but an AV does, that's a huge problem for any of the makers, software makers, vehicle makers in that space. And we need to solve that through regulation. It's very interesting also to compare what different countries are doing. For example, Europe, the policy environment has been to ensure that insurance companies are still the intermediary. So you don't have an individual pedestrian who got injured by a level 3 or an autonomous car having to sue an automaker, because that's a very unfair fight. They can go to an insurance company, have the insurance company settle that on their behalf. So that argues there is a role for insurance companies, just at much lower revenue levels than what insurance companies are making today. And I think some of that has to get sorted out as a policy discussion. That's not popular in Silicon Valley. Most entrepreneurs want the government to stay out of their hair. But I think this is an area where we do need alignment between so many different parties. I don't know if you guys agree. There's usually a wide variety of points of view on this.
Well, I was just going to add, because I like that question a lot. If you look behind me, I started in the taxi business. This was a business that was regulated and limited entry. And it was for a reason, because taxis were the ones to invest in the early years in the infrastructure for two-way radio, later mobile data terminals. And so there was a need of public necessity and convenience, or convenience and necessity, to have a limited number of units. And then we saw the disruption, and frankly, the industry needed to be disrupted because the service wasn't very good. But now I think that pendulum is going to swing, and I think it's going to swing back towards regulation. And who's going to push the regulation? Surprisingly, I think it'll come in part from the large operators, who will see that with the kind of billions that are invested in autonomous vehicles, that they will need to limit entry, that it will be a race to the bottom. If everybody can operate these services, there will be a saturation in the market. No one will make any money, and they'll say we need to limit entry.
Takitra?
I think it's really important to not refer to level 1, 2, and 3 as autonomous vehicles. I think the consumer confusion is rampant. I think we could actually cause more harm before we have the chance to cause good. And I think we should call everything that's driver assist. So drivers, remember, they have to remain alert. And it is harder to drive. I mean, we've been doing this study for a long time. It is harder to drive when you've unplugged from the task and you're doing other things. So I think we also have to really grapple with every autonomous vehicle that's not level 4 or level 5 is introducing complexity into the system. It might also be helpful for people, but people have to understand the limitations. And I think how many people stick around once you sell them something to really understand all the fine print? It's just not the nature of the beast. We're excited because we're going to unplug. And so I think we all have to be really careful to talk about fully autonomous vehicles as the human not needing to take over in the most safety critical moment. I think policymakers are starting to understand that. I think industry leaders understand that, but underappreciate the confusion in among consumers. So that's an issue that I think, to your question, Paul, of like, how does all this get sorted out? I think it's going to be sort of agreeing on some guardrails that will either prevent or usher in sort of safer roads, the opportunity at stake. And I think that's just one sort of easy one that we can all agree on. If you have to assist the vehicle, you have to be in the seat, you have to have a driver's license, and you have to be able to take over. If you're sitting in the back seat and there's no human driver, the technology has to be capable of the domain in which it is driving you. And then there isn't a confusion about who's at fault. You know, who's at fault, and all of those really complex issues, I think, are going to take years to solve, and we'll use common law until we use statute. And that's going to be fine, but it's going to be a finder of fact, right? Were you driving? Was the Tesla driving? Was the system driving? I think on the question of like, how do you bring everyone along on this? To me, one of the areas I worry about the most as someone who did policy work for a long time and then moved into this is, you know, making sure there's a distribution of expertise, right? I think we've all talked about, some people on this call have moved from one company to the next and been in mobility for a really long time. We need to make sure that the governments actually have the expertise needed to understand when they have someone sitting in front of them talking about the capability of the technology. What does unsafe look like? What does safe look like? And we know there's just a massive gap there now. So in my mind, that's like to the question of what's most likely to happen. We could regulate too fast and have a race to a safety sort of bottom, as Mark said, or it's going to take a really, really long time and we could really erode public trust and consumer confidence because of what happens in the gap.
Jane?
Well said, Takitra. That's exactly where I was heading is, you know, we need to call it what it is. And, you know, I was at OnStar years ago and I would start my talks with 40,000 people killed in the United States a year. And now 10 years, and it went way down because vehicles got safer. And now we're way back up again. We're at 42,000 a year already. It's getting worse. And I think it's a complexity of driving, and we are all also distracted with all the other things we're doing in cars. And people having done OnStar, it was amazing to me, as you know, that's a product inside a vehicle. How many people did not understand what OnStar was, right? They thought it was some kind of, global satellite system and this and that and whatever. And they don't understand the vehicle. They don't understand the complexity of the software inside the vehicle now. I'm not as bullish on how fast that technology is going to move. I think driving is really, really hard, and we do an amazing job of it, considering the kind of situations we get into. And I think the story is out on how many lives it will save versus not save. So there, we don't have measures. And what I'm a bit nervous about is that states and regulators will come up with measures that don't make sense. And so, one of the measures that everybody talks about is how many vehicle miles traveled of these autonomous vehicles. And now you see fleets of autonomous vehicles going up and down Highway 5 all day long, trying to get their vehicle miles in. And it's really how many miles in very edge cases do you have? What have you engaged with? And how did you get yourself out of that situation? And how did your technology work? What does your compute stack look? And where are the edges in your compute stack? So there's a huge education effort that's going to have to go on, particularly at DOTs and Fed level, because transportation is in this huge transformation, and people that make decisions need that background because they didn't grow up with these software stacks that we're all very comfortable with.
Rashik?
Yeah, I wanted to give a different perspective here. I know we're all focusing on the future of mobility and autonomous vehicles and the number of, traffic-related deaths. But with me changing my focus and focusing on real estate and more on an urban environment and the perspective of an urban environment, as well as, I spent 6 weeks in Europe and got a rental car, and I probably used it for 3 days out of the 6 weeks, and the rest of the time just walking around and using bikes and so forth. I think we need to realize that the future of mobility is not all about autonomous vehicles. It is really about this vision of, many cities have imposed this vision zero, and focusing on having a safe community where various modes of mobility coexist together, as well as, reducing and eliminating, deaths. Because besides the close to 40,000 deaths in vehicles, there were more than 6,500 deaths of pedestrians, back in 2020 as an example. And that has increased significantly in the last decade. So I think, when we think about where we're going and how we focus on it and the regulations behind it, there's been a lot of effort and focus. And with many of the mobility companies I've worked with in the last decade plus, they've all put this top of mind, but they can't do this in a silo. It requires a more cohesive approach. So I think that's just something to keep in mind for everybody on the call as we think about the technical aspect of realizing this future.
All right, Stefan.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with what Rashik and Takidra just said, but I want to add three fact nuggets to it that I think will be interesting, right? The first is, if you think about it, we federally regulate what can be called organic, but we don't federally regulate what can be called autonomous. When you think about that, it's kind of bizarre, right? Second is, Jane mentioned that we've been getting so much worse in ground transportation. That's really all due to distraction. And yet the federal government doesn't measure the problem correctly, right? Federal statistics show 1,500 people die from distraction. In our fleet deployments across 800 fleets, which are commercial drivers who are on average 10 times better than the average consumer driver, right? So think about this population that's 10 times better than the average driver. 70% of their collisions are people who are distracted. So this is really a distraction problem. And of that, 80% is cell phones. So why have we accepted that people are driving around with a 1.5, 2 ton piece of steel or aluminum that are allowed to be distracted? It's that combination that's deadly. So, my view on the safety problem is very simple. Let's go solve that problem first. Autonomous vehicles are great. But I think to your point, right, the infrastructure, how do you create safe streets? How do you create walkable areas where you don't need a car to get from A to B, whether that's subways or scooters or mixtures of bikes and scooters? There are lots of solutions to this problem, and AVs definitely have an important role to play, but not the only role. The third thing I would add is, we get all excited thinking autonomous vehicles will be everywhere. And I see this a lot on Wall Street now, which still has the buzz about autonomous vehicles in a way that Silicon Valley VCs no longer do because they've moved on. And they assume that every vehicle everywhere for every use case is going to be autonomous. But I ask you to think about just most commercial vehicles outside of long haul trucking, where the driver is really just moving goods from A to B. And what are most vehicles out there? They're light commercial vehicles. They're installers, maintenance technicians, telecom, utility linemen. Their job isn't mainly driving. Driving is an essential necessity of getting to their job site, but actually they're doing some kind of other transformative work. And they don't have any use for an autonomous vehicle, right? They're employed by the utility or by AT&T for that time that they're driving, no matter what. There's no labor savings giving those people an AV. And yes, you might make them safer, but if you can get them 70, 80% collision reduction without giving them a fully autonomous vehicle, that's much less expensive and much more quickly possible than, to Dragos's point earlier, right? To designing an AV for these crowded, urban, busy scenarios that are really, really hard. So where a lot of the attention's going to the wrong places, I think is the upshot lesson of that, because we're not actually framing the problem the right way.
Arvid, what's your perspective?
Yeah, so a bit more back to the question that you asked first, Paul, about how can we make sure the regulations are somewhat in line with one another. And my first thought was, we mentioned the aviation industry, right? So what's the motivation? Why do countries, governments, regulators tend to agree to certain things? And I think with aviation, it's pretty clear, because everybody wants to participate, right? You don't want a country where planes cannot land or take off. So what is the common ground here? That's the thought I have here. And I think the question is, what's the common ground for this ecosystem to work? I have a similar experience in trying to make a fuel cell ecosystem work in California many years ago. And my core learning was, if not every player in this ecosystem has an advantage or even just a financial win, it's not going to work. And that's maybe what we have to think about. What is the win? What's the driver, the motivation for all these players to come together? And what makes them agree to a certain set of regulations to make these things go forward, right? And I think the difficult thing is become bad before it gets better, worse before it gets better. It's a bit like climate change, right? Now the woods are burning everywhere and the water is rising and we have lots of natural catastrophes. Now the pressure is high enough for people to actually start changing. So it really is about what's the driver for the players to come together and talk. And I think we have to address it at that point. And often it is money, right? That is the driver, at least for the big corporations.
Okay. Jane?
Yeah, I just wanted to comment that, when we get into these kinds of discussions, we always end up on autonomous vehicles as being the future. And, it's really about building cities that are safe and equitable and harmonious and happy places to live. And we've got too many people on the road. We can't put everybody out in a car. We've got to do the mode shifts. We've got to get people on transit systems. We've got to get, this is where I go back to the control. How do we control all this mobility? We've got to have transit signal priority so that people, so buses need to be competitive with a personal vehicle, and they're not right now. In my trek from home in Oakland to Berkeley, it took an hour and 15 minutes on a bus, and I could drive it in 20 minutes. So we need to change the way we think about this infrastructure, and we have to make it easy for people to get places on bicycles, to walk places, to not have to drive across, 4 cities to go to their shopping or their, we need to start rethinking about how people move and how we control how people move. And, as Stefan said, a lot of the people on the road are there because they have to go do something that has nothing to do with, working while they're in the car, not just, in the back seat. They're there for economical reasons that these businesses are trying to manage. And so we just need to make it more fluid and make sure that transit and all these other modes of mobility are competitive with a single occupancy vehicle. And we're not doing that yet. We need to change that.
Dragos?
Yeah, really quick to Jane's point. I saw a great quote the other day that said the sign of a developed country is not when poor people can afford a car to drive, but when rich people want to use mass transit. And if we can get to that state, that would be awesome.
Well, which does tie to speed and frequency, right? I mean, I always give the example of the town I grew up in, Vienna, 60% transit modal share, one of the highest in the world. And if you look at a time schedule for public transit in Vienna, it starts at 4:30, 4:45, 5 o'clock, and you get a couple of 15-minute intervals. And then most of the middle of the day is ... which means every 2 minutes a vehicle shows up. And it's game changing when you think about that, because now you no longer have to plan schedules, and you don't have to anticipate where am I going, right? You just get on the next vehicle that shows up. The only place in the United States where you can have that experience is New York. If you talk to New Yorkers using the subway is faster than taking your personal car down Fifth Avenue in Manhattan. And so people ride it. And it's the same model, right? You go on the platform and you get on, either the next train or the second train, depending on whether you're taking the express or not. So.
Hey, Rashid.
Just one additional point, and maybe it leads to a question here is, we're talking about the future of mobility and where things are going. I do want to take a step back and reflect on that we had an interesting period in the last few years with the pandemic. And it gave us a unique data set in the sense of what would happen when no one's on the road. A unique data set of what happens when you have a bunch of people on the road that have forgot how to drive, because there was a little scary period there when people really started getting back and you're like, what the heck just happened? And then the risk, to Stefan's point about, mass transit, the risk of losing 50 years of development of the public transportation system just because of lack of funding and lack of, utilization, especially getting the necessary fare box rates to support the budget. So I think there's a lot of interesting components of what has happened. So it could either help accelerate that future mobility that we're all talking about, or it can be a hindrance to realizing that. And this steady state that we all talk about could be significantly swayed one direction or the other. So I'm just curious from the panel here of from your experience, what was an important lesson learned that we should all take from here to apply with our respective businesses?
So, all right, Peter, what's your perspective on from particularly in Australia? What's your experience?
I think the whole concept of one size fitting all is very challenging when you have a vast big brown land like ours, because essentially if you go 2 hours out of Sydney, you're pretty much not going to get any signal from anything. So when we talk about a connected network that allows us to have a significant number of autonomous vehicles, that's a big challenge. When if you want to drive from one side or travel from one side of the country to the other via vehicle, it's going to take you around 3 days in Australia. So from our perspective, I think what we've spoken about today is having more consumer-focused services that are actually going to get people to leave their cars at home. I mean, it's horrendously expensive to take your car into Sydney. And Sydney was designed for horse and carts. It wasn't really designed for cars. So if you want to park in Sydney, it can be up to $90 Australian dollars an hour to park. So there is real emphasis to try and get people out of their cars and onto public transport services. But at the moment, the infrastructure doesn't really allow that because geographically we're so spread out. So when it comes to the application of autonomous technology around that mass transport, about the only one that we have in our jurisdiction that is autonomous now are the trams that run through the center of the city. And one of the big problems we have with that is because they are almost completely silent, they often run over people. So we also have to understand that people have to understand, even with the technology we have around those autonomous trams, we're still having pedestrian collisions because, like many people said, I think everyone's on their phone and got the headphones on. And so it's become, a challenge for us. But geographically for us, because we've got very few people and a lot of space, we are going to find it hard to develop systems that can be addressed around the country. And I think we talked about alignment between states and legislation. In a country like Australia, we don't even have a common rail gauge yet. So to try and get the different state governments to agree to a set of standards that can be implemented nationwide, I think is going to be particularly challenging. And I'd be interested to hear what happens currently in America, particularly about who is responsible for the setting the standards. Is it as there is a federal government that overarches the basic rules and then it's applied state to state? Because in Australia, we have a thing for every vehicle, whether it's a bus, a truck, a car, a truck trailer, it has to meet what they call the Australian design rules. But the Australian design rules are still catching up with the technology around zero emission vehicles. So as I mentioned earlier, we don't have a set of defined standards that we build to now for the hydrogen buses we manufacture. We use European and Japanese standards because the technology has exceeded the ability of the legislators to actually write the standards. So I'd be interested to get alignment between the states, I think is going to be a challenging thing. So I'd be interested to hear how it happens currently in other jurisdictions.
Well, Gary, I'd be interested in your perspective because you're inventing or creating a relatively brand new mode of transportation, opportunity to create a whole new business model. It's an area that has to be regulated. You're talking about air mobility. And I'm tempted to use the phrase blue ocean strategy, but that probably applied as much to your prior venture, which was autonomous ocean-going vehicles. So what's your perspective? Because you have the opportunity to actually shape or be shaped by government regulations. What's your perspective?
Yeah, it's interesting. Like we all are involved in technology, and sometimes you can get lost in terms of what's the art of the possible. And so we can build all this stuff. We can build, and again, autonomy is an overused word for sure. There usually is a human in the loop somewhere. But we can get lost in the art of what's technically possible. And there's a huge, in our case in aviation, it is federally mandated. It's just, what you live with. So each country or collection of countries has their standards. It's not state by state or province by province. And so you have to work the policy level. For our market segment, that is demonstrating and showing a safety case. Proving the safety case. So, you start with the national regulators and we've been working as an example with the FAA for years and that will continue for years more before things get into service. But the other part that is a huge one that we spend a lot of time on and that a lot of people don't talk about is just the education of the masses. Because if they're not educated about these different options, that they're safe, et cetera, it won't happen. If it's not easy, if it's not inexpensive, if it's not safe, people aren't going to use it. They're going to keep driving their cars and keep, wait in line for an hour to get on their commercial aircraft. They'll just do different modes of transportation. And so there's a whole technology bit that has to get solved. But from a policy perspective, it's federal government and state, but it's mostly federal, in an aviation sense. But the education side of what we would call social acceptance is just massive and educating people on that. And so It's as much effort as the technology, like building the pieces that make the system work. The effort that has to go into policy and go into education of potential consumers is massive.
How much, I'm going to follow up with a question for you. In your, as objective but wild dreams of what your particular industry might create, how much impact will that have on the complexity of land-based mobility, particularly in urban centers like Jane's talked about and such? How much of a solution to land-based might it be?
Do that quote one level down. What do you mean by impact on land-based?
Well, as more people are commuting by in the air,
sure.
that's taking cars off the road.
Sure.
They might be able to ban cars in cities or something like that and just get around, except for ambulances and that type of thing. How do you really see that as a that potential?
Absolutely. I mean, and so instead of blue ocean, we call it blue sky. That's the blue sky view, is that you're able to rely on less cars, less road and bridge infrastructure, less parking structures, you know, whether it's, you know, commercially at your workplace or at home, you know, things change. And so if we're successful at this, which there's, you know, again, billions of dollars that are being funneled down this path for this future mobility path, life will change, cities will change, infrastructure will change. And we hope we can alleviate some of the problems that we have now on crumbling infrastructure and congestion. And so, you know, absolutely wouldn't be doing this role and this company if we didn't believe that it was possible to fundamentally change transportation.
So, all right. Well, I'm going to transition into questions from the attendees. The audience, I have some that were submitted prior to the panel conversation today, and some that are on. I'll start with John Shaw, who sent one on about the impact of in the transition to autonomous transportation, electric vehicles, and if it occurs faster than predicted. Do you guys envision any major challenges, opportunities around waste management of the redundant modes of transport? I assume my vehicle and those type of things, where we start getting rid of our own vehicles and using other ones. What are the thoughts?
I can make a few comments here. So typically what happens today is that vehicles in one, let's say, modern market live a second life in the less modern market, less developed market. That may accelerate. I think it's very improbable that all markets will make the move faster than the life of such assets. And maybe that rate will then increase. I think, though, that the rate of renewing these assets in the modern markets is accelerated a little bit, but it's never going to be so high that it's just a big loss of money. I don't think so.
Anybody else? Mark?
I think we're going to start to see a lot of interesting things happening with second life of batteries. So we can see that you take the large bus batteries, those can be great storage, energy storage, and even the smaller batteries will be managed and reconfigured in ways that'll be, I think, pretty efficient. So that's something to keep your eye on.
Yeah, and just to follow up from Mark's point and Arvid's point is, some of the discussions that I've been involved with revolves around national security, because with normal ICE vehicles, there isn't necessarily an asset like a battery, whereas now when we see certain regulations that are coming about on maintaining battery systems within a certain country and recycling it, how does that have an impact with the second life of the vehicle itself? So it doesn't necessarily leave the U.S. or leaves the U.S. without that battery in place. So there's going to be some, restrictions based on national security implications.
Okay. I've got another question on one of the questions submitted is, and I think it relates to some of the conversation here where some of the auto manufacturers are going vertical integration of supply chain into mining for other minerals and so forth. And who's manufacturing, who's designing, who's moving fastest on implementing some of the new technologies, new modes of transportation. Which countries do you think will benefit the most or lose the most in this transition? Which will be the extremes? who will be leaders, who might be laggards. And it could be anywhere in the supply chain or the actual systems. Arvid?
I think one topic that Rashid just mentioned is, and I'm thinking about this too, why does, for example, the United States not have good public transportation systems, Manhattan excluded? I think the geographical situation that also Peter mentioned is a challenge. If the country is so big and the population density is not there, you struggle much more than in a small country like the Netherlands, very small, or of course big cities like Tokyo, places like Beijing, China, Shanghai, the big Chinese cities. So there are geographical and population density factors that are really hard to overcome to create profitable systems.
Yeah, I think from our experience is that when we started moving towards the manufacture of zero-emission vehicles, we realized you couldn't do it in isolation, particularly as we just said, because of the geographical challenges and the very small, population of Australia. So we have this coalition of competencies from the ethical capture of energy through to infrastructure providers, through to the operation and maintenance and finance of those assets, then fleet operators, then vehicle suppliers like myself. And then we also have linkages into the educational institutions so that we can actually take the current workforces, transition them from what they've been doing into the new technologies that we're actually rolling out, and then work with the educational institutions and everything from vocational training, at a very low level right up to PhDs. And it's that integration from start to finish and providing a turnkey solution that is actually becoming very much the model here in Australia. And I'd be interested to hear if you're having that sort of cooperation of commerce occurring in Australia to deliver significant change and manage how that change occurs.
Okay. Stefan?
I was going to give it a slightly divergent answer to your question, Paul, or the question you read, which is, who wins? I think the answer is less about which country and more about cities will win versus rural areas. And I think that's a dynamic that's important to watch, right? A lot of the innovations we're talking about are going to make city life, downtown life, much, much better, right? When we get, if you take the European examples, a lot of the streets in the Vienna that I grew up in are now pedestrian zones. It is an incredible quality of life. You can eat outside. Many of us got a taste of that in the Bay Area when temporarily streets were closed to have outdoor dining. And it is a shame and a lack of political will that most of the city councils yielded to, a handful of small developers that represent a minority to change those things back to open streets. And in Palo Alto, we had 4 developers who overruled 30,000 residents that wanted to keep the streets closed through their donations. All right, that's to give a really extreme example. It's a rich town, of course, so those developers donate a lot of money. But that was a massive missed opportunity to really improve city quality of life in a significant way. So overall, I think cities will benefit, but there's certainly choices cities are making right now in this era that are going to make them winners or losers in terms of quality of life and how they adopt these technologies.
Jane?
Totally agree with Stefan there. And one of the things that people have talked about from the rural perspective, though, and probably Gary will agree, is this is where air taxis can come into play to connect rural people into cities. And so I think air mobility will change to try to accommodate the rural versus urban issues as well.
I'd like to take this question to both Keita and Gary, because the best of my knowledge, both of you have chosen, have a new mode of transportation, and you've already chosen certain locations, Arizona, Phoenix for Keita, and San Francisco, and a few others. And I'm just wondering what the criteria both of you used to pick which partners, what location, whether it's countries, cities, areas, between urban, remote. What are the characteristics that you look for besides just willingness to partner?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, it's whether or not a community has transportation pain points, which it's not hard to find communities that do. Second, we've talked about is the regulatory framework, whether or not the policymakers have sort of thoughtfully considered how this technology could be introduced into communities. In Arizona in particular, there was an executive order which became the law. That was helpful because, sort of to the point that was made earlier, I don't think associating sort of this new technology and new sort of unfamiliarity with consumer mindset coupled with lack of regulation can easily lead to skepticism. And so I think having some framework in place and signing up to it as a company that recognizes that's what responsible companies do. And then third, it's actually the community engagement. You know, we think the only way you actually end up with these cars being adopted and used in people's everyday lives once you get over the thrill of it all is because it actually addresses a need. And so we went out and we partnered with organizations that had members who won't ever drive. And we asked them whether or not they would partner with us. And so Foundation for Blind Children, Foundation for Senior Living, whether you're going to turn 16 and never be able to drive by yourself or drive period, or whether you're going to have the conversation and have the keys taken away from you. These were sort of natural organizations that were grappling with the issue in a different way. And so we started there and then built out an entire approach to introduce the technology into the community over time. And that sort of co-creation of what do people need the most? What do we need to learn the most? We don't know. I mean, we're all talking about every issue that maybe except for what's happening in the sky, you know, we have to think about charging infrastructure. You know, we did a partnership with Valley Metro, the metro system, to figure out, can your kiss and rides be further out? Can you reduce congestion? Like, we're trying to help stakeholders learn as we learn, partnering with rental car companies for some of the storage of our vehicles in the other days, partnering with TransDev for our training of our autonomous specialists. So like, how do you bring the ecosystem along? It doesn't exist in the way that we need it. It exists in many other ways, but those industries also feel concerned about, are we going to be left behind or are we going to be a part of this? And so it's really important for us to think about it as enabling the ecosystem and not only disrupting. We want to disrupt the fatalities. We don't want to disrupt what's working in the ecosystem.
Oh, thank you. Jerry?
Yeah, I think the answer is absolutely similar, and it applies for the air just as it does on the ground. I mean, we look for obviously the most congested cities. You look for regulatory support, but even more than that, if you break it down to cities that we would partner with, and we've announced a few, and there are a lot more that we will. Some cities have the approach of, we see this as the future, we want to embrace you, you know, we're going to provide incentives, come on in. And others are like, well, you know, I've got this organization here and you can pay to play if you want to talk to us, sort of thing. And so it's really interesting as you go city by city of those that really want to play and those that are saying, hey, this is a new revenue source, you know, why don't you pay this nonprofit that we've set up, you know, if you want to talk to us. So it definitely informs our decisions in terms of where we're going to go. At the end of the day, we want to run a profitable service. One of the things that's changed, though, just take the LA basin, there are hundreds of routes that we could do. And one of the things that we've seen, we have access to a database that most people probably wouldn't be happy about, but you can track cell phone movement. You're not listening to conversations and doing that sort of thing, but cell phone movement, and the movement is changing, and it's certainly changed from COVID, and the routes have changed, and more people have gone into rural locations. So, you know, Jane, back to your comment, the routes have changed, the needs have changed, but there's an opportunity, a new opportunity to connect people that have moved to a rural location, but need to get in the city. And so things are changing. So we're always doing route analysis. It obviously has to do with where's the highest demand, who has the biggest problem, what's a problem that we can solve, you know, and apply that. And then what kind of support is there, both from the regulatory framework, the city framework, but also the community. And so this, you know, gets back to the community education. Have to do it early and often, and bring community along on this journey, or, you know, it'll be easy for somebody to stop, you know, progress in this area.
Okay, well, thank you. Let's go to another question, which was talking about the future. I mean, frankly, here in the United States and certainly California, we have an automobile culture of independent driving, and but what is the future of mass transit and high-speed rail was one of the questions, and I'll start with Mark.
Well, Jane hit on something that was very important. I mentioned earlier the user experience has to improve, and we wonder why it can't. Jane talked about transit signal prioritization. That technology is here. You can ride the Jerusalem light rail, and as the light rail approaches traffic lights, they're changing, and the vehicle doesn't stop in a city that has terrible traffic. So why isn't that done here in the States? And if I think Stefan talked about Vienna and frequency and speed of the rail system. So we can greatly improve these services. I think the concentration needs to be so where are these main corridors? Where can we attract more ridership? And to have buses and trains operate in a much more efficient way and stop running 40-foot buses in neighborhoods that don't have the ridership, run smaller vehicles, run them on demand, restructure that in a way that serves those neighborhoods, that provides a critical link to those neighborhoods to access the other transportation and services in the city. But why doesn't it happen? Because first of all, there are a lot of silos. The transit agency operates the transit. The DOT operates the lights, or the public works is operating the traffic lights. So one hand wants to improve the service, the other hand says, no, there's 11,000 lights in New York City. How many can be retimed in a year? How do we get signal prioritization? Who's going to coordinate between the transit operator and the transit operator and the city or the Department of Public Works? But where there's a will, there's a way. And what we need is that political will. And there needs to be a convening. And frankly, Paul, I think this kind of a group today, if we could bring together some of these folks here and others to really push these agencies to get together and say, okay, there can be a better user experience. The only other point I would say that to keep in mind are these various special interests. The operators themselves are often rewarded for inefficiency. So, if services are inefficient, you get paid more hours to run the service. And labor unions want to maintain those drivers who get paid to run a big vehicle in a neighborhood that doesn't need a big vehicle, because a small vehicle might not require a CDL despite the driver shortages. So, we need to solve these problems, but we need to do it by working together.
Okay, we have time for just a couple more very quick insights. But Jane, what's your perspective?
Well, I think Mark just pointed out all the sticky issues associated with mass transit, I think that the infrastructure isn't ready yet. And, it's coming. There's a huge opportunity here for people to come in and look at advanced control of traffic. And it could be at 3 different levels. It could be at the signal level. It could be at the MEC level. It could be at the cloud level. So there's all kinds of opportunity in here. But the transformation is happening, and the people who make a lot of the decisions are not there yet from an education perspective. And we have to help people be able to make those decisions with an educated background, and we're not there yet. So we got to push the transportation engineers to kind of get out of their silos and think in a systems perspective instead of their siloed view.
Stefan, I start with you. You get to finish up.
All right. Well, I agree with a lot of what Mark and Jane just said. Just a little bit more. I think the root problem is mindset in America. This is an American problem, unlike the other transportation problems we talked about, which are global. We think of public transit as welfare, and we think of it as something that needs fare box recovery and subsidies. If you look at internationally, many transit systems are profitable. How do they do that? Well, they do land development around the transit areas, which solves the density and solves the development problem. The second thing is we have the federal government funds infrastructure, but not vehicles and not service. And there's a break point, as I mentioned earlier, at 7-minute intervals where people stop looking at schedules and can ride. The third is we've got it all broken up. Jane mentioned 107 different government jurisdictions and entities in the Bay Area alone. They each plan separate service, separate schedules. When I was teaching at Stanford as a professor, I had my students plot out routes in the Bay Area. 2/3 of the time for those transit routes was waiting for the connection, because each county, each city has separate schedules and they don't connect. And you don't get that, right? In Vienna, you have 26 transit agencies who are all operating on one fare ticket, one schedule. And by the way, that was done in the paper world before apps. Now it's all one mobile app. It'd be even easier. Zurich is famously the same way. And you can go to Zurich airport and go from plane to train to walking to bicycle, all on the same system. That's the mindset that we've got to break. And I think a good summary of our whole discussion is we keep looking for the one silver bullet panacea, right? Oh, Uber and sharing is it, or AVs will be it. And the reality is we've got to design an efficient system that interoperates and that coordinates without necessarily giving up the fact that there's multiple agents. We think the only way to get a good transit system is New York, but we draw the wrong conclusion. New York has frequent schedules and a dense system, but it also happens to have one governing agency. But you look around the world, you don't have to have one governing agency owning all the assets. In fact, productivity in New York is lower than some of the other, coordinating bodies around the world. So it's a political will issue in the end. We've got to vote to change it.
Well, I think, Jane, you said this was a complex infrastructure, technology situation, and I think you guys have proven it today. But I just want to, on behalf of all the attendees, thank each and every one of our panelists for sharing both their time today to share your personal visions, the challenges you're facing, and having a conversation, an open conversation in front of us, so we can learn what you're dealing with and hopefully be supportive of building a safer, more equitable, more mobile, and more human-friendly transportation mobility system. So thank you all.